On the night of June 28, 1762, Catherine woke her lover with 3 words: "It is time." Within hours, she would ride at the head of 14,000 soldiers toward the Winter Palace and her own husband's throne. The coup took less than a day. The consequences reshaped an empire for centuries. And now, before this story unfolds further, may I take a small portion of your time and subscribe to this channel. Join thousands of history lovers on this journey through time. If this tale has earned your attention, a like and a comment go a long way. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? These stories have traveled centuries to reach you. Let us continue. Alexei Orlov stood in the doorway, his boots still caked with mud from the 30-kilometer ride, his face carrying news that needed no words. Pasek had been taken. The conspiracy that had grown for months in whispered conversations and secret oaths now dangled by a thread that Peter's interrogators would soon unravel. Catherine listened without interruption, her composure unsettling to the men who watched her receive what amounted to a death sentence. She had perhaps hours before her husband learned everything, before the arrests began, before she joined the long list of Russian royals who disappeared into fortress cells, never to emerge. Grigory Orlov moved to the window, checking the empty street below, his hand instinctively touching the pistol at his belt. The choice before her was absolute. She could flee now, take a fast horse toward the border, abandon everything she had built across 18 years of patient scheming, and live out her days as a minor German exile with a fascinating story. Or she could ride toward the soldiers who had sworn secret oaths to her cause and test whether those oaths would hold when morning came. Catherine asked for a moment alone. When the brothers returned, she had changed from her traveling clothes into a simple black dress, the color of mourning, though her husband still breathed, still ruled, still held every legal claim to the power she was about to seize. She spoke only 3 words: "We ride now." The carriage lurched forward through streets not yet touched by dawn, carrying a woman rehearsing the speech that would make her empress, or seal her execution. The Izmailovsky barracks smelled of men who slept in their uniforms, of gunpowder residue and stale tobacco, of the particular staleness that accumulates where soldiers wait for orders that never seem to matter. Sentries startled awake at the sight of a woman descending from a carriage in the gray pre-dawn light, their confusion deepening when they recognized the face of the Empress Consort appearing without announcement or escort at a military installation. The Orlov brothers had prepared this ground carefully across months of shared drinks and shared grievances, letting the soldiers voice their fury at a Tsar who worshipped the Prussian king their comrades had died fighting. Now, Catherine stood before these men and spoke not as the German princess she had been born, but as a Russian mother whose son's inheritance was threatened, as a defender of the Orthodox faith their emperor mocked openly, as the voice of every soldier whose sacrifice had been erased by a peace treaty that returned all their bloody conquests to the enemy. Silence held the courtyard for a long moment. Then a single voice rose with the old cry of acclamation. "Vivat!" Another joined it, then 10 more. Then the sound became a roar that echoed off stone walls as hundreds of soldiers shouted allegiance to their new sovereign. The regimental priest emerged carrying the cross, and Catherine knelt on the packed earth to swear her oath to protect Russia, feeling for the first time the weight of real power settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Before 7 in the morning, riders were already galloping toward every barracks in the city, carrying word that the revolution had begun. The morning light revealed a city transforming before its own eyes, as shop owners pausing at their thresholds found themselves witnessing history cascade through the streets of St. Petersburg. Word had leaped from the Izmailovsky barracks to the Semenovsky guards who threw their lot with Catherine before the church bells struck 8. and then to the Preobrazhensky regiment, whose lineage stretched back to Peter the Great himself, soldiers whose fathers and grandfathers had built this empire, now declaring for a new sovereign. Catherine accepted a guards officer uniform from Captain Talazine, the green coat too broad across her shoulders, the boots requiring extra stockings to fit properly, and she pinned her dark hair beneath a military cap with hands that had stopped trembling hours ago. She mounted a white horse, and the city seemed to hold its breath as she rode through streets suddenly crowded with people who sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding before them. The Kazan Cathedral rose golden in the summer morning light as Catherine entered to find the Archbishop of Novgorod waiting with vestments prepared and prayers rehearsed, a man of God who had placed his bet on this moment months before. His voice echoed through incense, thick air, as he proclaimed her empress and autocrat of all the Russias, and the bells began their clamor from every steeple in the city, a sound that carried across miles of Russian earth. 30 kilometers away at Peterhof, Peter III slept off the previous night's wine, dreaming perhaps of his toy soldiers, entirely unaware that his empire had already chosen another master. The fountains of Peterhof played their eternal music as Peter III had arranged tin soldiers on a tabletop battlefield, positioning Prussian regiments against Austrian forces in a recreation of campaigns fought by his hero, Frederick the Great, the enemy king he had inexplicably chosen to worship above all others. He was 34 years old, grandson of Peter the Great, through a line of succession no one could dispute. Yet he had been raised in the German Duchy of Holstein, where he learned to love German music and German customs and German military discipline, while developing an active contempt for the vast, cold nation he was destined to rule. Servants prepared decorations for his name day celebration, and Peter expected his wife to arrive from the capital bearing appropriate gifts and appropriate deference, never suspecting that she was at that moment riding at the head of his own soldiers. The first messenger arrived pale and stammering with news that made no sense. The guards had mutinied. The second messenger confirmed that Catherine had been proclaimed empress. Peter received this information with the paralysis of a man whose imagination simply could not accommodate catastrophe, issuing contradictory orders in the same breath. Weeping openly before his courtiers, proposing desperately that perhaps he and Catherine could rule together as partners. His advisors urged him toward Kronstadt, the island fortress whose guns commanded all approaches to St. Petersburg, where loyal naval forces might still rally to their rightful czar. Peter's yacht cut through the Baltic waters toward this final hope. But when the fortress walls came into view, the cannon were already manned by sailors who had sworn allegiance to Catherine. The carriage lurched through frozen landscapes that seemed to stretch beyond imagination as 14-year-old Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst pressed her fingers against glass, clouded by her own breath, and watched the endless Russian winter unfold before her. Her mother sat rigid with barely contained ambition, a woman of minor German nobility who had schemed for years through letters and favors and careful cultivation of distant connections to secure this invitation from Empress Elizabeth herself. Sophie understood precisely what she was: a girl with excellent tutors but no fortune, impressive bloodlines but no power, brought across a continent to be inspected like a mare at auction for the heir to the largest empire on earth. The cold seeped through every layer of wool and fur as the miles accumulated behind them, each village more alien than the last, the churches topped with onion domes instead of proper steeples, the people bundled in garments that seemed designed for a different species entirely. Elizabeth's court at St. Petersburg blazed with a magnificence that made the grandest German palace look provincial, and Sophie absorbed every detail with eyes that revealed nothing of the calculations occurring behind them. They brought her to meet Grand Duke Peter, and she found a pale, nervous young man who spoke obsessively about military formations and his admiration for Frederick of Prussia, showing no interest in the empire he would inherit, or the girl who might share it with him. Sophie smiled and listened, and offered appropriate responses, while something cold and determined crystallized inside her. That night she began rising before dawn to study Russian in secret, understanding already that she would not merely marry this strange country, but would have to become it entirely, or be destroyed. Incense hung so thick in the cathedral that Sophie could taste it as she knelt before the golden iconostasis and prepared to surrender everything she had been. The priests chanted in Church Slavonic, a language she had studied secretly, until the sounds became familiar, if not entirely understood. And Empress Elizabeth watched from her throne with eyes that evaluated every gesture for sincerity. Sophie renounced her Lutheran faith with words she had rehearsed until they flowed without hesitation, and when she rose, she bore a new name, Catherine. The German girl from Anhalt-Zerbst ceased to exist in the eyes of church and state, replaced by a Russian Grand Duchess whose past began at this very moment. Elizabeth was a woman whose great beauty had faded into suspicious watchfulness, and Catherine recognized immediately that the Empress wanted a vessel for producing heirs, rather than a mind that might one day compete for influence. So Catherine became what was required. She attended every Orthodox service with visible devotion. She read Russian histories until she could discuss the old princes and their conquests. She learned the names of servants and remembered details about their families, building networks of loyalty among people the court considered invisible. The wedding in August of 1745 exceeded any spectacle Sophie could have imagined in her provincial German girlhood. Thousands of candles and rivers of silk and jewels that could ransom kingdoms. That night her husband arranged toy soldiers on their bedroom floor, while she sat alone on the marriage bed waiting for a consummation that would not come. She would later write in her memoirs that she spent that first night weeping, but she also spent it calculating. The candle burned low as Catherine turned pages that could have earned her exile if discovered in her possession, works by Voltaire, whose wit cut through the pretensions of monarchy, treatises by Montesquieu on the nature of laws and liberty, histories of Tacitus describing how empires rot from within when ruled by fools. These midnight hours in her private apartments became her true education, a secret curriculum that the Russian court would never have sanctioned for a woman whose only expected contribution was the production of heirs. Her marriage had collapsed into a polite performance of mutual contempt, Peter parading his mistresses through the palace, while Catherine smiled and said nothing, her public demeanor so perfectly calibrated that observers saw only a dutiful wife, bearing her burdens with grace. Empress Elizabeth watched her with increasing suspicion, sensing perhaps that too much intelligence lurked behind those carefully downcast eyes. So Catherine learned to speak of fashion and cards and hunting, to present herself as charmingly empty whenever the Empress was near. 8 years passed without a child, and the whispers grew louder, the pressure from Elizabeth more relentless, the question of succession becoming a crisis that centered on Catherine's apparently barren womb. The court itself was a labyrinth of factions and informants where a careless word could mean Siberia, where favorites rose and vanished with terrifying speed, where trust was a currency too expensive for anyone to spend. Catherine navigated these dangers in profound intellectual isolation, her mind filled with ideas she could share with no one. Then in 1752, she noticed a charming officer named Sergei Saltykov, whose eyes held something other than calculation. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine passion. The labor pains tore through Catherine, while Empress Elizabeth paced the outer chambers with an anxiety that had nothing to do with maternal concern for her nephew's wife, and everything to do with dynastic survival. In December of 1754, Catherine finally produced what Russia demanded: a son, an heir, a boy who would carry the bloodline of Peter the Great into another generation. Elizabeth swept into the birthing chamber and took the infant before Catherine could properly hold him, carrying Grand Duke Paul away to the imperial nurseries where he would be raised, according to the Empress's exacting standards. Catherine lay in the bloody sheets, emptied and alone, and would not see her son for months afterward, except in brief supervised audiences where she was treated as a visitor to her own child's life. Whispers had already begun circulating through the court about the boy's true paternity, for Peter was widely believed incapable of fathering children, and everyone knew of Catherine's connection to the handsome Sergei Saltykov. The truth remained shrouded in deliberate ambiguity, useful to Elizabeth, who needed a legitimate heir regardless of biological reality. Peter responded to fatherhood with indifference that curdled into active resentment, as though the child's existence somehow represented a victory for Catherine in their private war. Catherine learned to compose her features into serene acceptance, while rage built behind her eyes, understanding now that her son would always be a pawn in games played by others. She had given Russia an heir, and Russia had taken him completely. When a young Polish diplomat named Stanisław Poniatowski appeared at court with charm and intelligence and access to European secrets, Catherine found herself drawn toward possibilities beyond mere passion. Stanisław Poniatowski spoke in hushed tones about the movements of armies and the secret negotiations between courts, while Catherine absorbed every detail with the focus of a general preparing for a campaign she could not yet name. Her apartments had become a crossroads where information flowed from across Europe, carried by a Polish diplomat whose love for her was genuine, but whose real value lay in the intelligence networks he could access. Catherine had learned to cultivate usefulness in those who surrounded her, building connections with military officers who chafed under policies they despised, and court officials who recognized that the succession would eventually create opportunities for the well-positioned. The Orlov brothers emerged from the ranks of the Imperial Guard like figures from a different world entirely: Grigory, with his bold good looks and easy confidence; Alexei, with sharper features and a calculating mind that matched Catherine's own. They spoke for a military establishment that had bled across battlefields fighting Prussia, while their future Tsar openly worshipped the Prussian king. Elizabeth's health deteriorated visibly through these years, her once legendary beauty ravaged by illness and excess, and everyone understood that the succession grew closer with each passing month. Catherine gave birth to a daughter in 1757, a child almost certainly fathered by Poniatowski. But little Anna died in infancy, and Catherine mourned behind closed doors while presenting stoic acceptance to the court. The 7 Years' War raged across the continent, Russian soldiers dying by the thousands against Frederick the Great's forces, and Peter made no secret of his belief that Russia fought on the wrong side. On Christmas Day, 1761, Empress Elizabeth finally died, and Peter III ascended to the throne. Catherine's transformation from survivor to strategist was complete. The crown sat awkwardly on Peter's head, as though it recognized the unsuitability of its new wearer, and when he giggled during the most solemn moment of the coronation liturgy, the assembled nobles exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about the disaster now unfolding. Within weeks, Peter announced the decision that would seal his fate, withdrawing Russia from the 7 Years' War and returning every inch of conquered Prussian territory without compensation, erasing the sacrifices of soldiers who had frozen and bled across those battlefields. He threatened the Orthodox Church with secularization of its lands and appeared visibly drunk at sacred ceremonies, showing contempt for rituals that bound the Russian people to their faith and their sovereign. His mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, sat beside him at state dinners, where he openly mocked Catherine, describing her as cold and foreign, and suggesting that perhaps their marriage had been a mistake from the beginning. Word reached Catherine through reliable channels that Peter discussed divorcing her and declaring their son Paul illegitimate, clearing the way for marriage to his mistress, and the founding of a new line. Exile to a remote convent was the best outcome Catherine could expect from such proceedings. The officers of the Imperial Guard watched their Tsar toast Frederick the Great at banquets, and felt their fury crystallize into something actionable. Grigory Orlov came to Catherine with reports that the military stood ready to support her claim whenever she chose to make it. The calculations that had sustained her for 18 years simplified into pure survival mathematics. In late June, a conspirator named Pasek grew careless and was arrested. Catherine received word that she had hours before the entire plot unraveled. The formal dinner at Peterhof proceeded with its usual tedium, while Catherine smiled at jests that were not amusing and nodded at observations that were not wise, her composure so perfect that not a soul in the glittering room could have guessed she was counting the hours until revolution. Peter drank heavily and spoke of his upcoming name day celebration with the enthusiasm of a child anticipating present, mentioning between courses that he intended soon to resolve what he called the Catherine problem, once and for all. She excused herself early, pleading a headache that required rest, and the Tsar waved her away without interest, already deep in conversation about Prussian military tactics with an equally intoxicated companion. In her private chambers, the coded message waited. Pasek had been arrested. The conspiracy was unraveling. Move tonight, or face the consequences tomorrow. Catherine fed letters into the fire and watched years of careful correspondence curl into ash, then wrote final instructions to allies who would need to act without her guidance if everything went wrong. She walked to her son Paul's nursery and stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, this child she had borne and barely knew, understanding that after tonight, she would either rule his future or have no future at all. The carriage departed through the strange brightness of the Russian midsummer night, when the sun barely dips below the horizon, wheels creaking over roads that smelled of dust and approaching dawn. The journey to St. Petersburg stretched across 30 kilometers of absolute commitment, every mile carrying her further from safety and closer to either a throne or an executioner's block. 14,000 soldiers marched through St. Petersburg with Catherine at their head, the streets echoing with cheers from crowds who sensed they were witnessing something that would reshape their world entirely. Peter had sailed to Kronstadt, hoping to rally the naval fortress, only to find cannon pointed at his yacht and sailors shouting allegiance to his wife. And now he retreated to Oranienbaum, where his smaller palace offered no protection against the forces closing around him. Frantic letters poured from his writing desk, proposing compromises that grew more desperate with each passing hour, offering to share power as co-rulers, to abdicate in exchange for safe passage to his beloved Holstein, to accept any terms that would preserve his life and his dignity. Catherine read none of them. Her single demand arrived with the finality of a blade. Unconditional abdication. By evening, Peter signed away everything his grandfather had built, renouncing in a rambling and barely coherent document all claims to the Russian throne for himself and his descendants forever. He asked only to be allowed to return to Germany with his mistress Elizabeth Vorontsova, his violin, and his dog, the modest requests of a man who had finally understood how completely he had lost. Catherine accepted the abdication and rejected the conditions. Soldiers escorted Peter to Ropsha, a remote estate where he was told his detention would be temporary, while arrangements were made for his future. Alexei Orlov commanded the guard detail, and the brothers who had engineered Catherine's triumph now held her husband's life in their hands. The coup had succeeded beyond all expectation, yet the most dangerous piece remained on the board. Peter sat in a small room at Ropsha, writing letters that pleaded for the simple comforts that might make captivity bearable. His doctor to treat the illness that left him weak and feverish, his dog for companionship, his mistress Elizabeth, whose presence might restore some fragment of dignity to his shattered existence. 1 week had passed since his abdication, and the temporary detention showed no signs of ending, the guards growing less respectful with each passing day, the isolation pressing against his mind like a physical weight. On July 6th, Catherine received word that her husband was dead. The official announcement attributed his demise to hemorrhoidal colic, a medical diagnosis so absurd that it convinced no one, yet remained the formal explanation for centuries afterward. The probable truth arrived in a letter from Alexei Orlov that Catherine read once and immediately burned, its contents forever lost to history, though witnesses recalled Orlov's agitation and references to an altercation that had spiraled beyond intentions. Whether Catherine had ordered her husband's death or merely created conditions where ambitious men understood what outcome would please their new sovereign remains debated among historians who can examine only fragments of evidence. She declared public mourning with expressions of shock and grief that may have been genuine or may have been the finest performance of her considerable theatrical abilities. The political calculus was undeniable. A living former czar would have served as a rallying point for every disaffected noble and foreign power seeking to destabilize her reign. Peter was buried with minimal ceremony in the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. Catherine did not attend. Moscow's ancient Kremlin blazed with golden domes as Catherine entered the city that had crowned Russian sovereigns for centuries, her gown of silver and ermine catching the September light like armor forged from precious metal. The coronation she had designed exceeded any ceremony in Russian memory, calculated to overwhelm every doubt about her legitimacy with spectacle so magnificent that questions of blood and birthright would seem petty beside such evident majesty. When the moment came for the imperial crown to be placed upon her head, Catherine took it in her own hands and lifted it herself, a symbolic declaration that she owed her throne to no power on earth, neither church, nor noble faction, nor foreign alliance. The crown weighed nearly 5 pounds, diamonds and pearls surrounding a massive red spinel, and as it settled against her brow, she felt both its physical weight and the weight of everything it represented pressing down upon her. She rewarded her supporters with extraordinary generosity, distributing titles and estates, and thousands of serfs to those whose loyalty had made this moment possible, transforming the Orlov brothers into counts possessed of wealth beyond imagination. Yet behind the celebration waited realities that no coronation could resolve. The treasury was empty. The military remained demoralized from a war, abandoned without victory. Nobles watched her with suspicion masked by ceremony, calculating their positions in this new order, and already reports arrived of pretenders emerging across the vast empire, men claiming to be Peter III miraculously survived, gathering followers among peasants who believed their true Tsar would return to free them from bondage. That night in her private chambers, Catherine read intelligence about unrest stirring in the distant Urals. Books covered every surface of Catherine's private study, volumes of philosophy and history and political theory stacked beside correspondence that connected her to the finest minds in Europe. She wrote to Voltaire with the enthusiasm of a devoted student, discussing principles of rational governance and religious tolerance, while the aged philosopher responded with flattery that bordered on worship of his royal disciple. Diderot received her patronage for his encyclopédie when French authorities threatened to suppress the great project, and Catherine presented herself to the intellectual world as proof that enlightened autocracy could transform even the most backward nation. The Nakas became her masterwork, a comprehensive legal code drawn from Montesquieu and Beccaria that promised equality before law, regardless of birth, religious tolerance that would end centuries of persecution, and strict limits on the torture that had always characterized Russian justice. She convened a legislative commission with representatives from every corner of the empire except the serfs who comprised the vast majority of her subjects. And for months these delegates debated principles that seemed to herald a new era. Yet every proposed reform crashed against the same immovable reality. Catherine's power rested on noble support, and noble wealth depended entirely on the labor of millions held in bondage. Her relationship with Grigory Orlov cooled as the years passed, and a pattern emerged that would define her private life. Young officers elevated into her favor, educated and refined at her expense, then eventually dismissed with generous pensions when passion faded. Meanwhile, in the distant Urals, a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev began gathering followers with an extraordinary claim. Catherine traced her fingers across maps that showed the borders of her empire and the territories beyond them that might someday bear the Russian eagle. The Ottoman Empire sprawled to the south, its once fearsome military now weakened by corruption and decay, blocking Russian access to the warm waters of the Black Sea that could transform commerce and naval power. In 1768, war erupted, and Catherine's armies proved devastatingly effective, crushing Ottoman forces in battle after battle, while the Russian fleet sailed from the Baltic around the entire European continent to find the Turkish navy at Chesma. The burning of that fleet illuminated the night sky as ship after ship exploded, thousands of Ottoman sailors perishing in waters turned to fire, and when dawn came, Russia had announced itself as a Mediterranean power. Poland presented a different opportunity. Catherine had placed her former lover Stanisław Poniatowski on the Polish throne as a puppet whose strings she held from St. Petersburg. And in 1772 she joined with Prussia and Austria to carve away vast territories from a nation too weak to resist. A proud people watched their country begin to disappear, partition by partition, from the map of Europe. Catherine collected the spoils of empire with systematic appetite, acquiring art and sculpture and libraries that formed the nucleus of what would become the Hermitage, one of the world's great museums. She acquired new lovers with similar methodology, young officers who caught her eye and received education and refinement before eventual generous dismissal. The map of Europe was reshaping itself according to her will. But while her armies triumphed in distant lands, a different kind of army gathered in the east. Along the Yaik River, where Cossack traditions still burned fierce against imperial encroachment, a charismatic figure displayed scars he claimed were wounds from the assassination Catherine had ordered, proof that Peter III had survived to reclaim his throne and free his people. Yemelyan Pugachev possessed the rough magnetism of a born leader, and his message ignited the dried tinder of peasant rage that had accumulated across generations of bondage. He promised everything the serfs dreamed of in their darkest midnight prayers: freedom from landlords, redistribution of land, restoration of traditional rights crushed by modernizing emperors. The rebellion exploded across the Urals and Volga with a fury that consumed entire provinces, serfs rising against masters with axes and pitchforks, noble families dragged from manor houses and tortured to death by crowds drunk on sudden power and long-suppressed hatred. Towns fell to Pugachev's growing army. Regular military units sent to suppress the uprising were annihilated by forces that fought with the desperate courage of men who had nothing left to lose. Catherine initially dismissed reports as exaggerated provincial disorder, but her contempt transformed to genuine fear as the rebellion swelled beyond anything Russia had witnessed since the time of troubles. The propaganda she had crafted to justify her coup now turned against her. Peasants believing that the good Tsar Peter would have freed them and that the German usurper had murdered their liberator. Entire regiments vanished into the eastern chaos. By late 1774, Pugachev's forces threatened Moscow itself, and Catherine contemplated fleeing her capital. General Panin's forces swept eastward with methodical brutality, reconquering territory village by burning village, while the rebellion that had threatened to consume the empire began its collapse into desperate retreat. Pugachev found himself betrayed by the same Cossack officers who had elevated his cause, men who calculated that delivering the false Tsar might purchase imperial mercy for themselves. They bound him and surrendered their leader to government forces who transported him to Moscow in an iron cage. Displayed like a wild animal, along roads lined with peasants who had believed he would set them free. The trial was brief, and the sentence predetermined. In January 1775, Pugachev was tortured publicly in Moscow's Central Square before crowds who watched the man they had followed dismembered piece by piece. Catherine ordered what she termed enlightened clemency, decreeing that he be beheaded before the quartering rather than after, and presented this small mercy as evidence of her humane governance. Tens of thousands lay dead across devastated provinces where fields would lie fallow for years, and manor houses stood as burned ruins. Catherine's response was not reform, but systematic repression, crushing the Cossack autonomy that had enabled the uprising and restructuring provincial governance to ensure such threats could never gather strength again. She never mentioned Pugachev in her memoirs, erasing the rebellion from the official narrative of her glorious reign. Her enlightenment, dreams of gradually liberating the serfs, died quietly in those blood-soaked months. The millions in bondage would wait until 1861 for freedom Catherine had once imagined granting. Grigory Potemkin arrived in Catherine's life like a force of nature, a giant of a man who had lost an eye in circumstances that only added to his mysterious appeal. Brilliant and unstable, and utterly unlike anyone she had known. Their passion ignited with an intensity that shocked even the jaded observers of the Russian court. But what developed between them transcended physical attraction into something that resembled partnership between equals. Evidence suggests they married secretly in a ceremony whose details remain disputed, and whether or not legal bonds existed, Potemkin became her co-ruler in everything but official title. He conquered the Crimean Peninsula and annexed it for Russia in 1783, founded cities that still bear significance today, including Odessa and Sevastopol, and built the Black Sea Fleet that transformed Russian naval power. Stories emerged of elaborate fake villages constructed along Catherine's travel routes to impress her with false prosperity, and whether truth or slander, Potemkin villages entered the language as a symbol of deceptive appearances. They exchanged thousands of letters mixing tender endearments with strategic calculations, Catherine governing from St. Petersburg, while Potemkin carved an empire from the southern frontier. Other favorites passed through Catherine's chambers, young officers like Zavadovsky and Zorik, and the beloved Landskoi, whose early death genuinely grieved her. But none displaced Potemkin from his unique position in her heart and her government. In 1791, on a roadside in the territories he had conquered, Potemkin died suddenly. Catherine received the news and collapsed. She locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing food and company, and those who knew her recognized that something essential had broken beyond repair. The hermitage blazed with 1,000 candles as Catherine presided over gatherings that brought together the finest minds and most talented artists Europe could offer, her court becoming a destination for philosophers who wished to witness enlightened monarchy in practice. She had transformed Russia's cultural landscape through sheer imperial will, founding schools that educated thousands, expanding the Academy of Sciences into an institution of genuine distinction, and assembling an art collection that rivaled any in the world. Russian literature and theater flourished under her patronage. Native talents encouraged to develop voices that would speak for their nation rather than merely echo European models. The Charter to the Nobility in 1785 formalized the privileges her power depended upon, exempting nobles from taxation and compulsory military service while confirming their absolute authority over the serfs who worked their lands. The Charter to the Towns granted urban communities measures of self-governance that seemed to promise gradual liberalization. The serfs received nothing. Catherine justified this contradiction to herself and to the philosophers who questioned her, arguing that Russia was not ready for rapid transformation, that reform must proceed gradually through education and example, that enlightened autocracy represented the only viable path for a vast empire of illiterate peasants. Her relationship with her son Paul had curdled into mutual suspicion and barely concealed hostility, Catherine keeping him far from power while lavishing attention on her grandsons Alexander and Constantine. She possessed everything an empress could desire, except someone who saw her simply as a woman. In 1789, revolution erupted in France, and the principles she had championed began beheading kings. Reports from Paris described scenes that made Catherine's blood freeze as she read of mobs storming the Bastille, of aristocrats dragged through streets, of a king reduced to a prisoner in his own capital. The Enlightenment principles she had celebrated in correspondence with Voltaire and patronage of Diderot were being applied with a literalness that revealed their revolutionary potential, and the philosopher queen who had styled herself a champion of reason now recognized those ideas as mortal threats to everything she had built. She banned French books from Russian circulation, expelled French residents suspected of carrying revolutionary contagion, and ordered arrests of anyone who spoke favorably of events unfolding in Paris. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 devastated her personally, for she saw in that fallen monarch a mirror of her own vulnerability, a sovereign destroyed by forces he had inadvertently nurtured. Alexander Radishchev published his journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, describing serfdom's horrors in terms that echoed the philosophies Catherine had once embraced, and she condemned the book as more dangerous than Pugachev, sentencing its author to death before commuting the penalty to Siberian exile. Poland provided distraction and expansion as the second and third partitions in 1793 and 1795 erased that nation entirely from the map of Europe, Catherine claiming the largest share of territories whose people would never forgive their absorption. The irony was inescapable. The empress who had corresponded with philosophers had become a reactionary despot, terrified of the ideas she once championed. At 66 years old, with declining health, she could no longer avoid the question that shadowed every throne. The morning of November 5th began as countless mornings had before, Catherine taking her coffee while reviewing correspondence and state papers in the private chambers where she conducted the business of empire. Documents lay prepared that would formalize her decision to bypass her son Paul and name her beloved grandson Alexander as heir. A final act of control, extending beyond her own mortality. She rose to use her dressing room, and there, alone among the ordinary furnishings of her private life, a massive stroke seized her brain, and she collapsed to the floor, where servants discovered her unconscious and barely breathing. They carried her to a mattress laid on the floor because her body proved too heavy to lift onto her bed. And there she remained for 37 hours, while doctors administered futile treatments, and courtiers gathered in adjacent chambers to whisper about what came next. Paul arrived at the Winter Palace, uncertain whether grief or triumph should govern his features. This son she had kept from power for decades, now watching the clock tick away the final hours of his exclusion. The unconscious empress breathed heavily, her face slack, her legendary mind already gone wherever consciousness goes when the body fails. At 9:45 on the evening of November 6, 1796, Catherine II, Empress of Russia, drew her last breath at 67 years old. Vulgar rumors about her death emerged almost immediately, scurrilous tales involving toilets and horses that bore no relationship to the mundane reality of a stroke in a dressing room. Paul found the documents his mother had prepared to disinherit him and fed them to the fire. Paul's first acts as Tsar carried the bitter satisfaction of a son who had waited decades to repudiate everything his mother represented. He reversed her policies with systematic determination, released prisoners she had confined, and performed an act of symbolic revenge that spoke louder than any decree. He ordered his father's body exhumed from its modest grave and reinterred with full imperial honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, forcing Catherine's remains to lie for eternity beside the husband she had almost certainly arranged to have murdered. The nobles who had thrived under Catherine's generous patronage found themselves subjected to Paul's erratic demands and humiliating regulations. The military that had conquered empires watched their new czar impose Prussian discipline with obsessive rigidity. Paul repeated every mistake his father had made, alienating precisely the forces that held the power to destroy him. In March 1801, barely 5 years after Catherine's death, officers entered Paul's bedchamber and strangled him in a coup that mirrored the events of 1762 with eerie precision. Alexander, the grandson Catherine had loved and groomed for succession, ascended to the throne his grandmother had tried to secure for him. He would lead Russia through the Napoleonic Wars and stand as the liberator of Europe when Napoleon finally fell, carrying forward the imperial project Catherine had expanded so dramatically. The serfs she had failed to liberate remained in bondage for another 65 years until Alexander II finally proclaimed emancipation in 1861. Paul's revenge on his mother's memory lasted 5 years. Her legacy endured for centuries. Return to that summer night in 1762, when a woman in a borrowed uniform rode through the pale darkness toward a future no one could predict, her heart racing with the knowledge that dawn would bring either a crown or a scaffold. Catherine added 200,000 square miles to Russian territory, more than any ruler before or since, transforming a regional power into a colossus that dominated European affairs. The hermitage she built houses treasures that draw millions of visitors who walk through galleries assembled by her restless appetite for beauty. Russian literature found its voice under her patronage, universities multiplied, and St. Petersburg achieved the architectural grandeur that still defines it. She proved that Russia could be ruled by a foreigner, by a woman, by a usurper whose legitimacy derived not from blood, but from sheer competence. Yet she also demonstrated the limits of reform when power depends upon injustice, choosing stability over liberation, preserving a system of human bondage that stunted Russian development for generations. The myths persist because she was too large a figure to be remembered as merely human. The sexual rumors and murder theories and Potemkin villages becoming permanent fixtures in a legend that refuses simple judgment. Was she great? She expanded an empire, corresponded with philosophers, and ruled over millions of slaves she chose not to free. A German princess with no claim to the Russian throne seized absolute power through courage and calculation, and the willingness to let her husband die. She ruled for 34 years and reshaped a continent. History remembers her greatness and her crimes without deciding which matters more, because she was both inextricably, and the consequences are still unfolding.